You are 2,000 feet above the German front line in the dead of night, and you have just switched off your engine. The propeller in front of you slows, sputters, and stops. Now there is only the wind, hissing over the wings of a biplane made of plywood and canvas, as you drop silently toward the enemy camp below. You are freezing. There is no cockpit around you, only open air and a leather flying suit stiff with cold. You have no parachute, no radio, and no gun. What you have is a stopwatch, a map, a flashlight held in your teeth, and 2 bombs slung under the wings of an aircraft that was built to teach farmers how to fly. In a few seconds, you will pull a wire, drop your bombs on sleeping soldiers, and restart your engine before the searchlights find you. You are a pilot of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, and the terrified German soldiers below have given you a name. They call you the Night Witches. This is one of the most extraordinary and least told stories of the Second World War, because every single person in this regiment, the pilots, the navigators, the mechanics, the armorers who loaded the bombs by hand in the dark, every one of them was a woman. Most were barely out of their teens. They flew obsolete crop dusters against the most powerful military machine on Earth, and they flew them so relentlessly and to such deadly effect that the enemy came to fear the mere sound of them in the dark. How does a regiment of young women, in aircraft slower than a modern car, become one of the most feared units on the entire Eastern Front? To understand that, you have to go back to a country fighting for its life. In the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany launched the largest invasion in human history, pouring millions of soldiers into the Soviet Union. Cities burned, whole armies were captured. The Soviet Union bled as no nation had ever bled, and it needed every hand it could find. Across the country, young women volunteered by the thousands, desperate to fight for their homeland, and again they were turned away. War, they were told, was men's work, but one woman had the power to change that. Her name was Marina Raskova, and she was already a national hero, one of the most famous aviators in the Soviet Union, a woman whose long-distance flight records had made her a household name. Raskova had received hundreds of letters from women pilots begging for a chance to serve. And Raskova had something almost no one else did. She had the ear of Joseph Stalin himself. Can you imagine the nerve it took to walk up to the most feared man in the country and ask him to let women fly into battle? He said yes. In October of 1941, orders came down to form 3 all-female air regiments. Raskova was flooded with volunteers, and she gathered her recruits from every corner of Soviet life: university students, factory workers, school teachers, and amateurs from the local flying clubs where many young Soviets had learned the basics of flight before the war. They came to the city of Engels, on the Volga, and there they were put through a brutal, compressed training program that crammed several years of aviation instruction into a matter of months. They learned to fly, to navigate, to service engines, and to load bombs, working from before dawn until long after dark. Out of this came the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. It was led throughout the war by a formidable and beloved commander named Yevdokia Bershanskaya, and it was unique even among the female units, because it remained entirely female from top to bottom for its whole existence. The pilots, the navigators, the mechanics who nursed the engines through the freezing nights, the armorers who heaved the bombs onto the wings by hand in the dark, all of them were women. They faced contempt before they ever faced the enemy. The women cut their hair short. They were issued men's uniforms and oversized boots and stuffed the toes with rags to make them fit. Male pilots and officers openly doubted them, assuming they would panic, break down, or simply die in the first weeks. The women answered the only way that mattered, by flying, and by flying better and harder than anyone had thought possible. And then they were handed the aircraft they would take to war. When they saw it, some of them must have wondered if it was a joke. The aircraft was the Polikarpov Po-2, and you need to understand exactly what it was, because it is central to everything that follows. The Po-2 was a 2-seat biplane, designed in the 1920s as a basic trainer and crop duster. It was made of a wooden frame covered in fabric. It had an open cockpit, exposed to the freezing night air. Its top speed was around 90 miles an hour, which meant it was slower than the stalling speed of the German fighter planes sent to hunt it, the speed below which those sleek modern fighters would simply fall out of the sky. It carried no defensive guns for most of the war. It had no radio. And it could carry only a tiny bomb load, at most a few bombs at a time, sometimes just 2. On paper, Sending this machine against the German army was madness. So how on earth did it become a weapon of terror? The answer is that the women turned every single one of the plane's weaknesses into a weapon. Start with that pitiful speed. A plane that flies at 90 miles an hour is nearly impossible for a fast fighter to shoot down, because the fighter comes screaming in at 3 or 4 times that speed and rockets past before the pilot can even aim. To slow down and match the little biplane, the fighter risks stalling and crashing. The Po-2 could also turn tighter and fly lower and slower than anything the Germans had, skimming just above the trees where fast aircraft dared not follow. The very thing that made it look helpless made it maddeningly hard to kill. Now add the darkness. The regiment flew only at night, and they developed a tactic of pure, chilling genius. As they approached a target, a German camp, a supply dump, a fuel depot, a river crossing, they would throttle back and cut their engines and glide in toward the target in total silence. No engine noise to warn the men below. The only sound the Po-2 made as it swept in was the soft whoosh of wind rushing over its wooden wings. To the German soldiers on the ground, jolted awake by bombs falling out of a silent sky, that whispering sound was the sound of death itself. They said it sounded like the sweep of a witch's broomstick, and so they named their tormentors the Nachthexen, the night witches. What must it have been like to lie in a trench and learn to dread not the roar of engines, but silence? The way the women worked a target was a carefully choreographed dance with death. They flew in groups of 3. 2 of the planes would fly in first as bait, deliberately drawing the German searchlights and anti-aircraft fire onto themselves, weaving and jinking to hold the enemy's attention. Then, while every gun and every light was fixed on the 2 decoys, the 3rd pilot would cut her engine and glide in through the darkness, unseen and unheard, to drop her bombs on the target below. Then the 3 would switch roles and do it again. They repeated this until every plane had dropped its bombs. And here is the part that defies belief. Because each little plane could carry so few bombs, one bombing run was never enough, so they simply went back, and back, and back again. In a single night, a night witch might fly 8, 10, 12 missions, landing to have her plane rearmed by the female ground crews in a matter of minutes, then taking off again into the dark. On the most intense nights, some pilots flew as many as 18 sorties before dawn. 18 times in one night, they crossed the front line, drew fire, glided in, and dropped their bombs. None of this would have been possible without the women on the ground. When a night witch landed, she did not stop for long. Teams of female mechanics and armorers swarmed the little biplane in the dark, refueling it, checking the engine, and manhandling the next load of bombs up onto the wing racks with their bare hands, in the cold, night after night. A skilled ground crew could turn a plane around in as little as 5 minutes, so that the pilot was climbing back into the sky almost as fast as she could taxi in. These women lifted thousands of bombs over the course of the war, their hands raw and their backs aching, and they are as much a part of the regiment's record as the pilots overhead. Every one of those 18 sorties in a night depended on someone on the ground working just as hard and just as tirelessly in the freezing dark. Now think about what that meant for the women themselves. In that open cockpit, there was no parachute for much of the war, partly because of the weight, partly because they flew so low that a parachute would have been useless anyway. If the plane was hit, you went down with it. And the aircraft that made them so hard to catch also made them horrifyingly fragile when they were caught. A plane of wood and fabric does not shrug off bullets. If a searchlight pinned you, and the anti-aircraft guns found you, or a night fighter finally got a shot, that canvas aircraft did not just crash. It caught fire in the air and burned like a paper lantern, with the crew trapped inside, falling. The women knew this every time they climbed into the cockpit. They flew through freezing wind that numbed their hands and faces, navigating by map and compass and a stopwatch, sometimes with a small flashlight, over enemy territory, knowing that a single beam of light finding them could turn their aircraft into a torch. And they went back the next night and did it again. Would you climb into a plywood plane with no parachute and fly toward the guns, not once, but 1,000 times? Consider, too, how they even found their targets. They had no radar, no radio to guide them, no sophisticated instruments of any kind. A pilot and her navigator found their way to a target in the dark using nothing but a map, a compass, a stopwatch, and their own eyes, timing their turns to the second and reading the shape of rivers, roads, and hills in the faint light of the moon and stars. to glide in silently and place a bomb on a specific bridge or fuel dump in the dark after navigating for miles over hostile country by dead reckoning took a level of skill and nerve that the men who mocked them could scarcely have matched. This was not luck. It was craft, practiced and perfected night after night until it became second nature. And they did it in an open cockpit, in temperatures so cold that their instruments sometimes froze and the wind cut through their flying suits like knives. Because that is roughly what many of them did. Take Nadezhda Popova, one of the regiment's most celebrated pilots, who flew an astonishing number of combat missions over the course of the war, later counted in the hundreds. She once described a single night in which her aircraft came back so riddled with bullet holes that she and her navigator counted them in amazement, marveling that they were still alive. On one mission, she was shot down and, making her way back to Soviet lines on the ground, fell in among a retreating column of soldiers and civilians and saw the full horror of the war up close. Then she went back to flying. Popova said, years later, that she sometimes looked up at the night sky and could not understand how she had survived, how any of them had. The regiment as a whole flew an almost unbelievable number of missions. Over the course of the war, the Night Witches flew more than 20,000 combat sorties and dropped many thousands of tons of bombs on the enemy. Not one of these women had a fast plane, a heavy bomb load, or any of the advantages of modern air power. They had numbers, nerve, and the willingness to go up again and again and again. The Germans came to hate and fear them in a way that reveals just how effective they were. There is a well-known account that German command was so tormented by these nightly raids that any pilot who managed to shoot down a Night Witch was promised a prestigious medal, the Iron Cross, on the spot. Think about that for a moment. The most modern air force in the world, with its screaming fighters and its aces, offering its highest honors to any man who could kill a young woman in a plywood crop duster. That is not the reward you offer for an easy target. That is the reward you offer to solve a problem you cannot otherwise solve. The Night Witches were not a nuisance. They were a genuine military weapon. Their constant harassment robbed German soldiers of sleep night after night, wore down their nerves, destroyed supplies and equipment, and forced the enemy to divert precious searchlights, guns, and fighters away from the front, just to deal with a regiment of biplanes. Fear, it turns out, is a weapon, and these women had learned to wield it with terrifying skill. But the cost was real, and it must not be softened. This was not a story where everyone came home. Over the years of fighting, the regiment lost around 30 of its women, killed in action or in accidents, young lives snuffed out over enemy lines or in the flames of a burning aircraft, and there was one loss that struck the whole movement to the heart. Marina Raskova, the woman who had made all of it possible, the hero who had persuaded Stalin to let women fly, was killed in early 1943 while leading a different one of her regiments, dying in a crash as she tried to land in terrible weather. She was given the first state funeral of the war, her ashes placed in the Kremlin wall. The women she had inspired flew on without her, carrying her memory with them into the dark. Every mission after that was, in a sense, flown in her name. Now here is the counterintuitive heart of this story, the thing that makes it more than just a tale of bravery. These young women were not chosen because they were expendable, and they were not sent up in obsolete planes as some kind of desperate gesture. They took an aircraft that every serious military mind had written off as useless, and through intelligence, discipline, and raw courage, they turned it into one of the most feared instruments on the Eastern Front. They understood their machine better than anyone, and they built their entire way of fighting around turning its flaws into advantages. Too slow to be shot down, too quiet to be heard, too small to be caught. They proved, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that the weapon matters less than the mind and the will behind it. And they did it while being doubted, mocked, and underestimated at every step, by their own side as much as by the enemy. By the end of the war, the recognition they had earned in blood finally came, at least in part. More than 20 of the Night Witches were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. Their regiment had one of the finest combat records of any unit of its kind. And yet, in one final insult, when the Great Victory Parade was held in Moscow to celebrate the defeat of Nazi Germany, the Night Witches were not invited to fly over Red Square. Their planes, they were told, were too slow. The very aircraft that had terrorized the German army for years, that had earned their pilots the country's highest medals, was judged too humble to appear at the celebration. It is a fitting final irony for a unit whose whole legend was built on being underestimated. History, however, has been kinder than that parade. Today, the Night Witches are remembered and honored around the world, their story pieced together from their own memoirs, from interviews with survivors like Nadezhda Popova who lived into old age, and from the records of the regiment itself. Through their own voices, across the decades, these women still speak. You are 2,000 feet above the German front line in the dead of night, and you have just switched off your engine. The propeller stops. The wind hisses over your wooden wings. Below you, an enemy camp lies sleeping, and in a few seconds, the men down there will wake to the whisper of your wings and the crash of your bombs, and they will curse the Night Witches once again. You have no parachute and no gun, only a stopwatch and a flashlight and nerve. In a moment, you will drop your bombs, restart your engine, and race for home through the dark. And then you will land, and let the mechanics reload your plane, and you will do it all over again before the sun comes up. They told you that war was not for women. They gave you a crop duster made of plywood and canvas and expected you to fail. Instead, you turned the night itself into your weapon and taught the most powerful army on earth to fear the sound of the wind.